Here's something I found interesting. Now, I'm not entirely sure how accurate this is, but according to the American Alliance of Museums, in 2023, 28% of U.S. adults reported having been to a museum in that past year. Now, I do understand that's broad, but I wonder, why is that? Is it an access issue? Maybe there's an intimidation factor, status? When I think about what this podcast is, and more so can be, it's about opening the door for more people to experience all that museums have to offer. You know, dismantling some barrier of entry, or at least letting more people know that museums can be and are for everyone. I'm Alex Pavljuk, the digital content strategist at the Montclair Art Museum, and welcome to episode 1 of Maybe Actually Museums Are For Me. Thanks for sticking around. I'm Alex Pavljuk, the digital content strategist at the Montclair Art Museum in, you guessed it, Montclair, New Jersey, which is about 15 or so miles outside of New York City. I've worked in the museum industry for a little over a year now, and I've been going to museums consistently since I was a sophomore in high school. And one of the things that always comes up in conversations at MAM, but also just in general amongst, friends and colleagues and stuff is, how do I approach a museum? Often, for the first time. I think that's a really great place to start for this inaugural episode. For me, like I said, I was in high school when I walked into a museum for the first time. It was the Museum of Modern Art, better known as the MoMA, in the city. I went on a French club trip in the fall of 2017. What drew me in, I think, was seeing Starry Night by Van Gogh in person. Something about that was beyond surreal. I think that's how I caught the bug. And that wasn't the first time I experienced art. In 6th grade, my family and I went to Italy, and I got to see The Last Supper in Milan. But that was going to a church, and it wasn't quite it's not like I walked into a museum in Italy and looked around at all the great works of Renaissance masters. It was just Da Vinci. Admittedly, I had a pretty big Da Vinci kick. But anyway, I was never proficient in art class as a kid. I got pretty decent at drawing trees and terrible flowers. My dad is a good artist. He's a jeweler. We did get a pretty good elementary art history education, shockingly. But that art education stuck with me because I've seen these prints and reproductions, and we've talked about it in classrooms my whole life, but now seeing it in front of me really just kind of was a sense of disbelief. It's a sensation that still sticks with me. I felt that way the first time I saw Monet after having a print of his hung in my dining room my whole life, and I felt that way most recently when I saw the Mona Lisa at the Louvre. Anyway, I'm getting a bit carried away, so let's talk with someone who could also help demystify the question, how do I approach a museum? Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Alex.
What's going on?
Thank you for having me on the inaugural episode of the MAM podcast.
Of course. I couldn't imagine doing it with anyone else, considering we sit next to each other in the marketing office.
Yeah, it definitely is a proximity thing, isn't it?
A little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. So you are the digital marketing specialist here at MAM.
Yes, we're a small department, so we all wear a lot of hats.
Yeah. But just talk to me a little bit about your role at MAM.
So like you said, my main kind of job is to update the MAM website. So any kind of exhibition information or program events or anything like that, I put on the website and I make sure it all works, technically speaking. And that, I guess the main thing that I do in terms of with the website and also with emails that I send out is getting information out to the public of whether that's about upcoming exhibitions or different programs we have or just how to get involved at MAM. It's making it as easy as possible for the public to find.
And you didn't study marketing, though?
No, I didn't study marketing at all at school.
What did you study?
I studied art history.
And I guess, how does that, affect your day-to-day, routine at work?
I think how it affects my job in the day-to-day is most relevant when it comes to exhibition information and information from curatorial. I feel like a lot of times art historians can write or present information in a very academic way, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that it might be in a way that the average person who maybe doesn't know that much about art history or art historical terms doesn't understand. So I try to take the essence of what the curatorial team is trying to do with, exhibition copy and all that stuff and condense it down into a way that the average person in the public can read about and understand what is coming and what it's about and get excited about it.
Do you remember the first time you went to a museum?
I can't say I do. I'm trying to think because, you know, when you were talking about being a kid and going to museums, I identified with that a lot. I do remember going on a trip when I was 10 or 11 years old, and we went to Paris as a family and going to those museums. And honestly, I could not have cared less about being in the Louvre or anywhere. I remember seeing the Mona Lisa, which is like the most famous thing, and being like, that's really cool. And then I was like, okay, I'm ready to go. Like, I remember sitting on a bench with my dad while my mom and my sisters looked at every single painting and being so bored and just kind of wanting to leave. I feel like a lot of my love for art history, at least it's stemmed from my love of history, period. Like growing up, I loved history, and that comes from both my parents are very much into history, but very different time periods. My mom is very much into classical history, ancient civilizations and things, and my dad, it's more kind of 20th century American stuff. So I grew up in a household that they just loved it. And I definitely inherited that. And like, that was my favorite subject at school. So I say for a long time, I was just going to kind of go the history route. And that's where my interest was. And then when I was a senior in high school and then into college is when I kind of developed this interest in art history and going to museums and going to art museums specifically. Because, you know, there's a lot of different types of museums you can go to that were more interesting to me as a young child.
Yeah. I think that kind of speaks to one of the broader questions about like approaching museums, especially for newcomers, like for a first time, is like finding something that you connect with that maybe feels adjacent or even distant to the institution that you're visiting. Like I, in like 5th or 6th grade, fell in love with Leonardo da Vinci, not because of his artwork, but because he was a character in my favorite video game at the time, which was like Assassin's Creed 2. And so that fueled my interest in going to see and learn about his artwork, which then drove going to see The Last Supper, or even still today, like, you know, clearly I was going to Paris to go to Paris, but to think that I'm not going to go to the Louvre and stand in a couple feet away from the Mona Lisa and stare at it while tourists are like taking selfies in front of it. Yeah. Well, and just be absolutely like zoned in on it.
Well, kind of like something similar happened to me is like, you know, growing up in an Italian household, you know, a lot of the artwork or like we had a statue of Michelangelo's Pietà, like a miniature one in our cabinet, like it always existed. And like the same thing where we'd have kind of like Italian Renaissance-esque prints and frames or whatever. So when I started like diving more into art history, I definitely went like, oh my God, Italian Renaissance, it's great. And I still believe that, but I've definitely expanded my appreciation and love. And yeah.
I feel very similarly in the sense that, and I touched on this in kind of like my preamble to this, but I didn't start going to museums consistently until I was in high school, until I like discovered French Club. And no, I didn't learn a lick of French, but I did really love those trips. And, you know, that was where I experienced like the MoMA for the first time. And like, you know, I got to see whether it was Picasso's or Van Gogh's or Monet's, I got to see all of that for the first time in a very major way. And then that following spring, still with the French Club, we ended up going to the Met, which was a consistency of all of high school was MoMA Met, like spring, fall. And the Met is massive. And especially for being there for your first time, it's incredibly daunting.
Yeah, it's very overwhelming.
Yeah. And so I kind of just followed behind my French teacher because we were good friends, and I just I'd never been there before. I didn't really understand like it's not to say that there's like a courtesy that you kind of have like in museums, like, but I'd say there's like some unspoken rules of just, you know, what long do you spend in front of a piece, or like when is it appropriate? What is appropriate to like
move on? How close do you get?
Exactly.
Like...
And so I was learning that and understanding that on the fly. And I don't think it's super rigid, but it is something that you like think about, especially not really experiencing any museum in any major way other than like the one previous to that same year. But I remember we stumbled into the room where, you know, you could see like Van Gogh's.
Oh yeah, like the impressionist, post-impressionism
Yeah,
stuff.
and it's like a maze to get there. It's not easy to find it.
Yeah, it's not like front and center. It's like you got to look for it.
And so I found myself in there, and I'm stumbling around, and I had seen the portrait of Van Gogh, and I saw the sunflowers, and I'm noticing works that are familiar to me, but have very little meaning to me. And I think that's the essence of, I think, approaching a museum for the first time, is finding something you can relate meaning to. And for me, it was walking around a corner and kind of getting stopped in my tracks because the same painting that we've had a print of my entire life hanging in my dining room is now staring back at me. And it's not like it was a Monet.
Yeah.
And it was not a famous one. It was a rather niche one.
Yeah.
It's like,
I love that. Like, that's my favorite part of like going to museums, is not necessarily like even finding something that you recognize from having seen before, but like stop seeing something and you're like, oh wait, I have to like pause for a second and like take it in. And it's like kind of awe-inspiring, or it's like oh, okay, like this is like something I'm doing, like I'm studying this, and here it is in person. Why it means so much to see it in person, but for me personally it does.
Do you think, I guess kind of in that same vein, and it does make sense as what you just said, but like, do you think having that art history degree does change the way you interact with museums, and like, does it define the way you explore a museum?
It does and it doesn't. It doesn't in the sense that I still like going to see something that maybe I didn't study or I don't have any prior knowledge of, and kind of like discovering something in the moment. I think that's really fun and interesting to me, is like going into a museum or an exhibition with little to no expectations and then coming out suddenly with a new passion for something I didn't have before. But yeah, a lot of times in these major museums like, Met and MoMA, you're gonna find big names and you're gonna find things that are more kind of mainstream outside the art world that everyone knows. And that's not a bad thing at all. I'm not trying to insinuate that it is. But it's kind of when you study anything, you have more knowledge of it. And, I can look at something that by someone that maybe I didn't study personally, but it's from a similar time period, and be like, oh yeah, I see the style, or I see like, oh yeah, this was happening in the world that influenced this movement or that person or blah, blah, blah. Or like, oh yeah, like I can more easily recognize either artists or art movements, which I enjoy, but I don't think it's necessary to have that knowledge prior, because you can just see something and be like, oh, this is interesting to me. I like how this looks. Let me learn more about it. I think that's where, and again, there's nothing I think inherently wrong with the differences, but like for me, it's like I don't have, my art history background is elementary school, baby. Yeah. Shout out Miss Williams. That was that's why like working, and I think this is something that is important to touch on. Like when I started working here, I didn't know what we had on display. Mm-hmm. Full stop. I did not know anything that was in our galleries. Yeah. Or what we even had in our permanent collection that's not currently on view, or at the time currently on view. So the first time that Asif, our boss, on my first day walked me as an intern through the galleries, and he just kind of casually goes, oh, there's our Andy Warhol. It's like, oh, that's a work I've seen before, and it's now just staring at me. Yeah. And then to, start working in the office and see over by the bathroom, the giant Georgia O'Keeffe like promotional banner. Yeah. And it's like, I was a child in my art class in second grade, like drawing like skulls because of her. Like that was something that was like taught to me as a child, and I'm working at an institution that has that in its collection. Yeah. It's whether it's on display or not, that's remarkable, and like does have like a profound and like moving effect to me, and like makes me emotional sometimes. It's really funny because I had almost the exact same experience where on like my first day, I started by working in admissions, and my supervisor for admissions, her name's Frances, she was taking me around to see like the entrances of the museum and everything. And by the main entrance where we have artwork hanging up in Lehman Court, she's like, oh yeah, there's a Jim Dye, and I know you you wrote your master's thesis on him. And I did. And I'm like, no one else would, maybe not everyone would know Jim Dine or anything, but or that wouldn't mean anything to them, but it meant so much to me. And I was like, oh my God, it's going to be like right where I'm sitting at admissions. And I was like, I can't believe my local museum or the museum I'm working at has that and it's on display. So yeah, it's again, you and I, very different kind of backgrounds, but we each have that kind of connection to art here on display.
I really think that idea and that notion does kind of connect our two thoughts and also bridge the idea of like, how do you approach a museum? And I think everything that we've talked about really does relate back to that idea in that, you know, finding threads and finding experiences and finding different, you know, themes or meanings or places that some of these works capture.
Yeah.
Even if you don't know the artist or don't know the history behind it, you can find that meaning tenfold. I don't like currently in our two exhibitions, Century 100 Years of Black Art at MAM and Family Community Belonging. I don't know any of the artists in Family Community Belonging. I have a special relationship with some of the works because I had been a part of content that we made around specifically the pole that's on view. But outside of that, it's more just I like the way they look.
Yeah.
And I have to, you know, have my own experiences with them and understand them. And there's works that call to me, but I don't know why they call to me. Something about the color, something about the composition, something about the detail or lack thereof within, say, there's a lot of portraiture on view in that exhibition. And it's like, I don't know why this image of people huddling around a oil lamp is speaking to me, but it is. And I think it's beautiful. I think that's where people who don't have maybe the confidence to walk into a museum and feel like they can understand what's on view or appreciate it as highly as somebody else kind of gets deconstructed. I think that's the whole point, is to find new things and love them and observe them and learn to understand them in your own special way.
I 100% agree with you. Art is a very personal thing. It's a very personal experience, and people viewing the same work of art can come up with a million different interpretations and experiences based on their own personal lives and what they've lived through or what they like or anything like that. Like you were saying, you know, my experience with something could make me either love or hate a work of art that you feel the complete opposite about. And that's kind of the beauty of art, in my opinion. Something that reminds me of either something personal in my life or something that I studied at school and spent a lot of time on could mean so much more to me, or that could be the thing that makes me stop and look a little bit closer. And that has happened where I see something and I either recognize the artist or I recognize the style. And that's the thing that makes me stop and look just a little bit longer. Once you have that moment of connection, then you just keep looking and you want to keep learning. But there are other instances, like you said, where in our exhibitions or our galleries here at MAM, where I don't know anything about what's on display. I don't know the people, but I like the look of something. It's visually stimulating to me or visually interesting. And that's what makes me stop and see, okay, who made this? What's on the wall label? And then as I learn more, I get more interested, and then I want to keep learning and I want to keep discovering. And then maybe I decide to go look up that artist or look and see what else is on display of them. And it kind of spirals from there. And that's the experience that anyone can have.
Yeah, I think that's really remarkable and absolutely true in so many ways. Thank you so much, Melissa, for doing this first episode.
Yeah, of course.